at least 21 people, including a child, have reportedly died as the regime cracks down on demonstrators demanding the end of theocratic rule. The rogue nation's Ayatollah speaking publicly on the protest for the first time, blaming Iran's adversaries. In the recent days, incidents, enemies of Iran utilized various means, including money, weapon, politics, and intelligence apparatuses to create problems for the Islamic system. But President Trump again weighing in, slamming Iran's brutal regime as he also takes a dig at his predecessor in the White House, tweeting, quote, "The people of Iran are finally acting against the brutal and corrupt Iranian regime. All of the money that President Obama so foolishly gave them went into terrorism and into their pockets. The people have little food, big inflation, and no human rights. The U.S. is watching." Earlier on America's Newsroom, former ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, said the president is doing the right thing by speaking out.
I think it's important for the president to speak out in support of the Iranian people. There are plenty of people in this country saying, oh, don't do anything. That's the wrong signal. The Iranian people need to know that the world is watching and is on their side.
Ambassador Bolton also says the U.S. should take more concrete steps to support the Iranian people, including more sanctions and pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal altogether. Connor Powell joins us live from Jerusalem with more. Connor?
Yes, Sandra, these protests that we're seeing right now in Iran are unique in comparison to what we've seen in the past. They began on Thursday in rural, more conservative religious cities like Mashtad, and it's been the more traditional conservative base of the Islamic Republic that have been taking to the streets, not the urban elite of Tehran that we saw back in 2009. The central complaint appears to be the economic situation in Iran and the widespread corruption there. In some places, women have ripped off their headscarves as well, and there have been calls to end the Islamic Republic. A crackdown there also seems to be intensifying. Iran's state media reporting that hundreds of people have been arrested and at least 20 people have been killed, with the majority just in the last 24, 36 hours or so, while Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, today blamed outside agitators and enemies of Iran for the protests, essentially trying to say that this is all outside forces that are sparking these protests. But Iran's president, Hassan Rouhani, is trying to walk a fine line. He's considered a moderate in the Iranian political atmosphere. And over the weekend, he acknowledged the protesters' legitimate grievances, but he also said that violence will not be tolerated. Now, Sandra, the big question is, will we see a large-scale crackdown like we did in 2009, or will the regime actually start to make some overtures to the complaints and to the protesters? That is not yet clear, and that's really what we're waiting to see. Is we're now on the sixth day. At some point, it feels like we're going to see sort of a bursting here, whether it's the government coming through with some concessions or a widespread crackdown on the people there protesting, Sandra.
Connor Powell, thank you for that. Meantime, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham says the wave of protests in Iran are a result of President Obama's failed policies for the country and the region, particularly when it comes to the nuclear deal he helped broker with Iran's rulers.
It tells us that the Obama approach of relieving sanctions, hoping the regime would moderate, has failed. The people are not getting the benefit of sanctions relief. They're more upset with their oppressors than ever. The money from sanction relief has gone into rebuilding the Iranian military, and they're destabilizing the Mideast. So if I were President Trump, I would have a nationwide address pretty soon explaining why the Iranian nuclear deal is a bad deal for the world, what a better deal would look like, and urge Congress and the European allies to get a better deal with Iran before it's too late.
So that's what he would do. What should the president do? Richard?
Well, I think that Lindsey Graham has a point here. And later in the interview, he talks about how North Korea is watching how President Trump handles Iran, because both of these are bad actors, and how you handle one determines how you handle the other in this sort of delicate balancing act for President Trump as we go into 2018. So I do think that this strategy of supporting the protesters is very important. It's a mistake that the President Obama made in 2009. But I still do believe in the merits of the Iran deal, of the Iran nuclear deal, because it slowed down their ability to have a nuclear weapon. And now we have got to deal with these individuals who are really pushing for wanting a democracy, wanting a new government. And we've got to sort of handhold this part, because we saw what happened in Egypt when there was a push for new government and the Muslim Brotherhood came in.
You know, Kennedy, Ambassador Bolton made a really good point, too, the distinction between 2009 and the post-election protests we saw then. That was protesting of the actual election. This is a much different situation where the regime itself is being protested.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's different economically in the way that you're seeing these expressions. And before in 2009, it was the middle class. It was people who had some money using their political voice. And now you're talking about people who've been truly economically hurt. They've been hit really hard by inflation in that country. And, there's obviously a much greater pool of people there who feel like they don't have as much to lose. So you're going to see, slightly different outcomes, because when you have more people with less to lose and they feel empowered and so frustrated, that we could see a very different end. And I think the press really likes contrasting the difference between this president and the former president. And, although they like to say that President Trump is being too brash and coarse and he's inserting himself too much in this, I think there's something important to learn from the lessons of President Obama holding back so much. Because, and I think in a positive way, we can say in the United States, we respect demonstrations. Freedom is the ultimate ideal, and we support you in that. And what that means of this administration is obviously vastly different than what it meant.
And the way the president left off his most recent tweet on this is, "We're watching." An important message, says Lindsey Graham, but we have to also act.
Right, yeah. President Trump said we were watching. He also said it's time for change. And there's also credible reports of Iranians chanting death to a dictator, that they no longer want to live under a murderous, oppressive regime. And there are stark differences between the way that President Obama handled Iran and how President Trump has handled Iran as well. And I think it was an intentional ignoring of what happened in 2009 for President Obama, because he had his eyes on the Iranian nuclear deal. That's what he wanted. That's what he staked his legacy on. So he ignored provocations from Iran. He ignored, according to the recent Political report, that he stood in the way of Project Cassandra. And he stood in the way of trying to stop a $1 billion per year drug and money laundering scheme by Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy. So, and we look at no less than a week after the Iranian deal, I think it was a week later, they put our sailors on their knees and shot it for propaganda purposes. And now you have President Trump, who even just in his rhetoric, we've seen such a change. And I think what this really does is underscore and highlight the Iran deal. What does President Trump do about it? What does Congress do?
And he did remind everybody in that tweet about those sailors, bringing it back to our attention. Perez?
So it's interesting about what you guys are pointing out on the difference between when they've had a revolution in the streets before and now, and calling for the death of the regime, is also what this regime might do in response. Social media is playing such a huge role in this. It's not just Iranians on the ground in Iran, it's those here in the United States and all around the world who are protesting with them. And so this government has shut down Instagram.
Yeah,
it's going after the via-ways, if you will, those digital alleys where people can get together and plan organized marches and protests. But in all of that, they've arrested 450 people. And here's where they're willing to go. And I was reading about this morning. It's called Muharaba. And that might be a red line. I don't know who it'll be a red line for, because who wants to go to war with Iran? But if they start killing those protesters based on this word, and that word is a legal term in Iran, and what it means is you have taken action against the state, punishable by death. That's the highest penalty. If they start to do that, whose red line is that, if you will?
And I think that's the complicated issue here. When you think about uprisings, and we've seen this, I think this has sort of been the trend of, I would say, this decade, right? We saw it first in Egypt. We saw it in Tunisia, Bahrain.
Yes, Tunisia is an excellent
and we just saw it in Zimbabwe a couple months ago when the people sort of rose up against Mugabe. And so this ideal of how we as... it was about time in Zimbabwe. How we, as sort of the world leader and the people who push for democracy, how do we handle these situations is a very interesting one on what the Trump doctrine will be. Will we be more interventionist? Will we sort of sit on the sideline and say we support these democratic protesters? Will we be part of putting in the new government? This is all going to play into what this doctrine will be. Will it be more interventionist like the Bush doctrine, or will it be more hands-off like the Obama doctrine? That's going to be the question.
All right, we've got a lot more to get to. New fallout after a report